the war, there are a number of different resources that you can use, but one of the challenges are the resources can be conflicting, and I sincerely hope that there's nobody from the Portage Historical Society or deeply knowledgeable on Portage history that will raise their hand and say, Pete, why don't you look at the book on Portage Civil War? I don't know if such a book exists. I have not found one. So if you know about it, don't tell me until after the talk. So really bad. But the main resources that I used for the talk tonight, the 1880 History of Columbia County, which just has a lot of good detailed history, the Register of Wisconsin Volunteers, which is an alphabetical history or alphabetical list of all of the veterans that served in the war. One volume. The roster of Wisconsin regiments is a list of soldiers in the war broken down by their regiment and by their company, and contains other information about the soldiers, such as when they mustered in, if they were wounded, if they got promoted, and when they mustered out. The Military History of Wisconsin by E.B. Quinter gives an excellent blow-by-blow, regiment-by-regiment history of what Wisconsin did in the war. So if you're looking for information on the 8th Wisconsin, they have a historical sketch on the 8th Wisconsin. It's a wonderful single source on Wisconsin in the war. And finally, there are a wonderful set of archival material at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. I mention that because when you read the 1880 history of Columbia County, you get a very good overview of Portage's contribution to the war, but they kind of, I think, give either a misinterpretation or exaggeration to some extent, especially in condition with these regiments here. If you look at the 1880 history, you would get the impression that the entire Company F, the 1st Wisconsin Heavy Artillery, came from the Portage area. However, or the same thing with Company D of the 14th Cavalry and Company D of the 10th Infantry. But if you look at that company-level roster of Company F of the Heavy Artillery, you find that only 2 men came from Portage. And I found the same thing in the 4th Regiment Cavalry and the 10th Infantry. And what I came to the conclusion was, it took me a while to hit this on me, but I saw the same thing years ago when I was researching Sauk County's history in the Civil War. For years I was director of the Sauk County Historical Society, and it dawned on me that perhaps the same thing is going on here as is in Baraboo. It comes back to the fact that Portage is the county seat. It's not that all of Company F came from the city of Portage, it's that Company F was raised in Portage. So that men from all around this area from Columbia County would have gone to Portage as the county seat to enlist in the Union Army. So this Portage was a significant point of enlistment. And after enough men were gathered to form a company, they'd be marched off to Camp Randall or some other training camp to complete their training before they actually went off to service in the field. And that would explain why these units are attributed as coming from Portage City. Maybe more likely they are from the Portage area, or simply they were raised in the city of Portage. Well, either way, that adds to kind of the dimension that when you're conducting research, the story isn't always as straight as you would like it to be. As it is, there are several regiments we are going to be focusing on tonight, 5 in particular, which had large numbers of men from Portage as a part of their numbers. I also want to point out one other aspect, though. Even though the 1st Wisconsin Heavy Artillery only had a few men from the city of Portage, and probably a larger number of men from the Columbia County area. And I'll back up to the reason why you know that is that in the roster of Wisconsin regiments, it shows where the men say they hail from. So where is their hometown? And so it's easy to tell from the track where these guys are coming from. But the 1st Wisconsin Heavy Artillery is one of those kinds of things that if you were enlisting that unit, you didn't see a lot of excitement in the war. It's a case in point that even in a historical event as dramatic and full of combat and such as the American Civil War, you can still be in the Army and not see a lot of service. The 1st Wisconsin Heavy Artillery, and this is a photograph of a heavy artillery unit on guard duty outside Washington, D.C. This would be the type of material that they would have been using. They were stuck around Washington, D.C., simply manning the artillery positions, waiting for a Confederate attack that never came. They never fired a shot in anger. So it's just one of the examples of the experiences that some of the men from Portage would go through during the war. Now, of the 5 units that we're going to talk about, the 19th Wisconsin, the 23rd Wisconsin, the 11th Wisconsin, and the 2nd and the 7th Wisconsin, the 19th Wisconsin also had a rather quiet existence early on in the war. They were Company D of the 19th Wisconsin, was largely organized out of men from the city of Portage, and they were trained at Camp Randall, Madison, something that we'll hear over and over again. Most units that I know of from Portage went to Camp Randall. So if any of you have ever watched a Badger game, or either were at Camp Randall or watched it on TV, you were either sitting in the training field or watching the training field, where most of the Civil War soldiers in Wisconsin actually learned their job before they went off to join the Army. And so the 19th Wisconsin goes off to Camp Randall, spends several months there, learns their job, and then eventually gets sent down. Oh, sorry. This is the 23rd Wisconsin. There we go. Got to get my right originals here. But fairly early on, they were sent off to Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk was a major naval base, was captured very early in the war. They do guard duty, they do garrison duty. They're protecting the community of Norfolk, but very quickly they're transferred to New Bern, North Carolina. New Bern is one of many little ports that were captured up and down the eastern seacoast as a part of the Union effort to slowly blockade the Confederacy. And it was captured very early, and it was a little enclave of kind of Union power in North Carolina, and a number of units were stationed there to protect that base. And 19th Wisconsin was one of them. And it actually points to one of my favorite photos that I have seen. This is actually the collection of the Sauk County Historical Society, and this is a photograph of members of the 19th Wisconsin manning their posts at New Bern, North Carolina. I do not know if this is Company A of the 19th, which came from Sauk County. It could very well be Company D. The photograph doesn't specify. It's just that it's members of the 19th Wisconsin, but this is the only photograph that I've ever come across of regional soldiers actually doing their duty in the field, included with blockhouses and artillery. It's a wonderful photograph. The 19th Wisconsin stays at New Bern for the better part of the war, but in 1864 they're transferred to Richmond. By that point, Ulysses S. Grant, who's now in command of all the Union armies, is fighting Robert E. Lee, and after a series of battles has pushed Lee right to the gates of Richmond and has engaged in a siege of Richmond. And the 19th Wisconsin is one of the units that's brought up to reinforce Grant's army in those siege operations. And they take part in a few small battles in and around Richmond as an effort to kind of end those siege operations. On the 30th of June, they are shifted slightly south. Grant has now shifted his focus from Richmond to the city of Petersburg. Petersburg was a very key strategic city for the Confederacy. It was the culmination of 4 railroads and 5 major roadways, all of which funneled into one railroad and one road that ran north into Richmond. It was the supply point for the city of Richmond. If you capture Petersburg, you would capture Richmond. And early in June, Grant makes a movement to try to storm and capture Petersburg. And in a battle in July 30th, with the 19th Wisconsin, which is with that group, they try to take Petersburg. The battle fails. And the Union fails, and a 10-month-long siege endures around Petersburg. The 19th Wisconsin is in that battle on the 30th of June, and they are engaged in the 10-month-long siege at Petersburg. We have examples of trench lines in and around Petersburg. That's what it would have looked like. It was everything you'd expect from a World War I battlefield. It was a brutal siege experience. The 19th stays in the trenches for most of the 10 months, and at the very end, in April 2nd or April 1st, 1865, Grant keeps kind of pushing the Confederate lines farther and farther and farther around the city, stretching the Confederate soldiers to the point where they only have like one man every 15 yards manning the trenches. Finally, on April 1st, 1865, Grant stretches the Confederates long enough where at the Battle of Five Forks, he breaks through the Confederate lines. And realizing that he snapped the Confederate defenses, he orders a general assault on the city of Petersburg throughout the entire lines. And on April 2nd, the 19th Wisconsin takes part in that general attack and helps break through the Confederate lines, ending the siege of Petersburg, forcing the surrender of Richmond. And 9 days later, Lee surrenders. The next day, on April 3rd, the 19th Wisconsin is one of the first units of the Union Army to enter the city of Richmond. The next regiment we will talk about is the 23rd Wisconsin. The 23rd Wisconsin was not in the Eastern Theater, they were in the Western Theater. They were also organized at Camp Randall, Wisconsin, in Madison, and then early on were sent down to guard railroad lines in Kentucky. But very quickly they were shifted to military operations in the Mississippi River Valley and some of its tributaries. Their first battles were at places called Arkansas Post and Fort Hinman, just some strategic points, kind of an attempt to take, I believe it was Little Rock. But then they are shifted to another figure we just talked about, Ulysses S. Grant. This time it's earlier in the war, and Grant is focused on capturing the city of Vicksburg. Now, Vicksburg is a very key strategic point for the Confederacy, and up until early 1863, it's fairly safe in the Confederate interior. Now, if you imagine in your mind's eye the state of Mississippi, imagine the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is right on the Mississippi River, right about in the middle of the state of Mississippi. And the thing is that throughout 1862, the Union has been slowly moving down the Mississippi River. They've captured Memphis. They're moving into northern Mississippi. They're moving from the south. They've taken New Orleans. They're going up to Baton Rouge. The plan is to use the Mississippi to cut the Confederacy in two. And by 1863, the only point left that's linking the Confederate Trans-Mississippi states of Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana, from the rest of the Confederacy in the east is the city of Vicksburg. The Confederates realize it, and it's a beautiful position to fortify. It's high on a bluff, and they turn it into an armed camp. And it's known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and it is almost an impregnable fortress. Throughout late 1862, early 1863, one Union Army after another tries to make an attempt to move from the north down to capture Vicksburg. They all fail. Grant tries a different tactic. He decides not to take a direct approach on Vicksburg. He takes his army across the Mississippi River through Arkansas and Louisiana and bypasses Vicksburg, marches south of the city with the help of the Union Navy, crosses the Mississippi River, and moves again north into the rear of the city, completely encircles it. The 23rd Wisconsin is with Grant when he makes that march and crosses the river. And they take part in all of the battles and the siege associated with that campaign. They're part of the opening battles at Port Gibson. They're involved in the Battle of Raymond, the Battle of Champions Hill, and the Battle of the Black River Bridge. And eventually, in all these are battles that the Confederate commanding officer, John C. Pemberton, he meets Grant right away at Port Gibson and tries to blunt his move into Mississippi, loses a battle, retreats, fights in the battle, loses it, retreats, and Grant is systematically forcing Pemberton back into his trenches into Vicksburg. Finally, he does so. He compels Pemberton to retreat into his fortifications, and a siege that ultimately lasts several weeks breaks out, and ultimately the Confederates surrendered on July 4th, 1863, one day after the Battle of Gettysburg. So those 2 days were probably the two most significant days in the Civil War, because at that point, the fortunes of the Confederacy almost, they can't be turned around at that point. With their country split in two, and then with Lee's army facing a disastrous defeat in Gettysburg, it was a crushing week for the Confederacy. The 23rd Wisconsin is involved in one of those very significant campaigns every step of the way. After the siege of Vicksburg, they are engaged in what is known as the Red River Campaign. It was a rather disastrous campaign to take the Louisiana city of Shreveport. It ends in absolute failure. It's a rather notorious campaign in the war. And they end their career in the war in another set of siege operations in Mobile. At the end of the war, Mobile is the last real port of the Confederacy open, and so the Union has finally gotten into a position where they can attack it, and they lay siege to the city. And actually, in the last 2 days of the war, April 8th and April 9th, the 23rd is involved in two battles. So one on April 8th to attack an outpost known as Spanish Fort, and then the next day they attacked Fort Blakely. Both were successes. And then April 9th, Lee surrenders and the war is essentially over. But so throughout their entire career, they're really kind of involved in Mississippi River Valley or central Midwestern battles. The image that we have down here is a late 19th century image, kind of a romanticized image of the siege of Vicksburg by Curzon Allison. The other gentleman here, though, is certainly a man worthy of note. This is Joshua Guppy. Joshua Guppy was a notable civic leader in Portage, a lawyer trained at Dartmouth prior to the war. He starts off the war as a lieutenant colonel in the 10th Wisconsin, but then moves to command the 23rd. And he is in command of the 23rd Wisconsin throughout most of the war, but through his meritorious services in the different campaigns is ultimately appointed in 1865 to Brigadier General. And so he is the only officer from Portage to achieve that high rank. So he is the highest ranking soldier to come out of Portage during the war. The 11th Wisconsin has a career that very closely mirrors the 23rd. And in many respects, the stories are exactly the same. Again, they're organized at Camp Randall, Wisconsin, so if you aren't seeing the pattern here a little bit, you should be at this point. But rather than being sent to Kentucky to guard railroads right away, they are sent to St. Louis. And so they're guarding railroad lines around that city. That's another early capture for the Union in the war. And again, early on, they are also attached to different military movements moving up and down the Mississippi River Valley. Like the 23rd, they join Grant in his campaign against Vicksburg, and they are at the battles of Port Gibson and Champions Hill and Black River Bridge. They are also involved in the siege of Vicksburg. After Vicksburg, they do not go to the Red River campaign. They're actually involved in a brief campaign to take to move against the Confederate or the state capital of Jackson, Mississippi. So they're involved in the Battle of Jackson, Mississippi. They're involved in a very obscure little campaign in the Bayou Teche country. I always like to say that because you never say Bayou Teche too often. In Louisiana, there's one of them, hundreds of little obscure campaigns that serve just small strategic purposes throughout the war. But they're involved in garrison duty at a place called Brashear City for a while. But then they rejoin the 23rd Wisconsin, and they also end the war in siege operations around Mobile, and are also involved in the siege of Spanish Fort and Fort Lakeland. Now the images that we have here, we have a contemporary view of the Black River Bridge battle site in Mississippi. I was lucky to find that one. We have a soldier here also from the 11th Wisconsin. Now this gentleman is not from Company H. He is from Company F, and he would have been formed out of the Sauk County area. But all the soldiers in the 11th were uniformed the same way. And so it's a good example. He's wearing a forage cap, dressed in a frock coat. He's wearing he has an Enfield rifle. So this is what the soldiers in Company H would have looked like. It's the only image of the soldier from Company H that I could find. The other image I have up here I threw in. At first I wasn't sure if I was going to use it or not, but I think it's an interesting illustration. This is a rather romanticized view of the siege at Vicksburg. It looks more like a grand chart than actual siege operations. This would have been printed in Leslie's Illustrated Frank Leslie's Illustrated Magazine, which was a contemporary of Harper's Weekly, a major newspaper during the time. And I threw it in here because for the folks living at home in Portage, this is how they would have viewed the war. Even though the Civil War was the first heavily photographed war in military history, most of the folks in Portage rarely saw any of those images. It's true, some of those historic photos, like say by Matthew Brady or other photographers, may have been sold at parlors in downtown Portage, but I suspect not a large amount of them. And even if they did, would you have the money to be able to purchase them because they were rather expensive? Soldiers or the family at home, the only way they really knew about the goings-on of the soldiers in the field would have been letters from the soldiers themselves, perhaps the local newspapers. As I say, Portage had several newspapers, Madison was putting out several newspapers, and soldiers in the field were corresponding with the newspapers and talking about their accounts and their reminiscences. You also had correspondents writing in those newspapers as well, but most of the Madison, and as far as I know, the Portage newspapers didn't have engraved illustrations. Only the larger national ones like Harper's Weekly and Leslie's would have had engravings like this, and so which would have been available in Madison or other communities in and around Wisconsin. So this is your MSNBC, your CNN. This is the picture that the folks at home would have had. So it's not the, if you imagine that image that I showed you of the trenches at Petersburg, which would have been similar to what Vicksburg would have looked like, that's the imagery that the soldiers saw. This is a picture of what the folks at home in Portage would have seen when they were reading news accounts of their soldiers in the front lines during the war. Now we get to probably the most famous units that come out of Wisconsin. Company G, or of Portage, I'm sorry. Company G of the 2nd Wisconsin and Company B of the 7th Wisconsin. We're going to talk about them together because they both formed part of the Iron Brigade. Perhaps one of the more famous units to form on either side during the war. The 2nd Wisconsin has a slightly longer history than the 7th. The 2nd Wisconsin was one of the earliest units to be formed for the Union Army, one of the very first units to actually be formed in Wisconsin. It was formed almost exclusively out of various militia units that were already existing in and around the state. And there was at least one major militia unit in Portage at the time. If I remember correctly. The 2nd Wisconsin was involved in some of the earliest battles, including the Battle of Bull Run. So they were there at the very beginning of the war. But by early 1862, The 2nd Wisconsin is merged, or is joined with the 7th Wisconsin, the 6th Wisconsin, I'm going to get these wrong, the 19th Indiana, and then later the 24th Michigan, to ultimately form what was then known as the Western Brigade, the All-Western Brigade. Now, we think of this more as Midwestern states, but in the 1860s, we were a part of the West. The country largely ended, to some extent. The Mississippi River was pretty close to the frontier. Iowa did exist, but we were on the farther ends of the country, and so at that time, we were known as Western soldiers during the war. We wore distinct black hats. These were Army dress hats, known as Hardy hats, that were bashed down with the months of service. But the brigade was known for its toughness in the field, and they were pretty hard to push around on a battlefield. They were known by the Confederates as the Black Hat Brigade. They were recognized because of those hats that they wore. The first battle that they fought together as a unit was Robeton, Virginia, which was a precursor to the Battle of Second Bull Run. And they were at the Battle of Second Bull Run in August of 1862. Later, that next month in September, they were at the Battle of South Mountain, which was a precursor to the Battle of Antietam. And they were also at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, 3,000 men killed in a single day. The Iron Brigade fought in, I believe, was the cornfield at Antietam, one of the more particularly vicious actions of the battlefield. So they were in the heat of some of the more significant battles of the war. The Iron Brigade was also present at the battles of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and they were also on the field of the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, although they were involved in those battles in slightly lesser roles. Their most dramatic moment, and also their most tragic moment, comes in July of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. And this painting actually depicts that moment. This is a painting by Keith Vogel, who was a contemporary artist who painted Civil War non-military images. The Iron Brigade and the 2nd Wisconsin were the first infantry soldiers on the field of battle for the Union in that battle. That's not cavalry soldiers, but infantry soldiers. Now, some of you may remember a number of years ago there was a movie made, Gettysburg. It wasn't that movie. It had points. The beginning of the battle talks about the Union cavalry under General John Buford, who's first in and around town and seizes the high ground for the Union Army and fights a desperate battle as Confederate soldiers are marching up division after division, and the Confederate Army and the elite are attacking his position, trying to gather that high ground around the city of Gettysburg. And he who holds the high ground will be the best position to win the battle. Well, Buford's hanging on by his fingernails because he's outgunned, he's outmanned, and he's waiting for the infantry to come up to support him. The first unit to arrive on the battlefield is the 1st Army Corps under this man, that's John Reynolds. And the first unit in the lead of the 1st Corps is the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps, and that is the Iron Brigade. And the very first unit of that brigade is the 2nd Wisconsin. And the situation is so dire for the Union that Reynolds himself, the Corps commander, goes out in the field and personally orders the 2nd Wisconsin into combat and personally leads them into a desperate attack against the Confederate brigade to try to push it back off of the hill. And that's what this scene depicts. And within minutes of this scene supposed to be painted, Reynolds is shot dead, and many of the men in the painting are also shot dead. The Iron Brigade, the entire brigade is mustered in battle. It's a very, very, very fierce battle, but the casualties are extremely high. As many as maybe 50 or 60% of the entire brigade are killed. And so it really breaks the back of the Iron Brigade. But they hold off the Confederates long enough for the rest of the Union Army under George Meade to come up and take the rest of the high ground outside of the city of Gettysburg, and allows the Union Army to be in the best position to win the battle. And so it's really this effort that some might argue actually that saved the day for the Union, and some could argue, really turn the tide in favor of the Union for the rest of the war. The 2nd and the 7th Wisconsin, even though they have taken extremely heavy casualties as a result of this battle, still remain on the field and are able to participate in a rather anticlimactic campaign in late 1863 known as the Mine Run Campaign. Ultimately results in a few small skirmishes, but nothing really substantial. But by the summer of 1864, the 2nd Wisconsin really was up. And so unlike many of the other regiments that are raised for the war, and most of the other regiments that we talked about tonight, which actually served through 1865, the 2nd Wisconsin goes home about a year before the end of the war. That's because these guys signed up right away in April of 1861. They've already served their 3-year enlistment. The 7th Wisconsin, a lot of their soldiers go home in the summer of 1864 as well, but there's just enough of them left that signed up a few months later. And so actually the regiment is split. Half the regiment that survived Gettysburg goes home, and about 3 companies worth of men stay behind. The Army has enough what we call sentimentality. They don't break up the 7th Wisconsin, and the unit is formed what's called the Independent Battalion of the 7th Wisconsin. About 3 companies worth of men stay with the Union Army and are involved in Grant's overland campaign, fighting the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and Pearl Harbor, are involved in some of the battles around the Siege of Petersburg, and are eventually mustered out in 1865. The Iron Brigade itself really ceases to exist in the way we think about it after fighting out in 1864. Now, up to this point, even including the experience in the Iron Brigade, the experience of Portage in the border is not unlike many other communities, even in rural Wisconsin. You've got soldiers, the Iron Brigade has companies arranged for the state. There's other regiments like the 8th Wisconsin, which have high dramatic moments as well. And many other communities who boast in the kind of record. But what separates out Portage from most of the other communities is Fort Winnebago. And that is because that post was a regular Army fort that had a string of regular Army officers pass through that in the 15 or so years that it was in existence, including these 3 men here. These were all men who were lower grade officers at the fort in the 1830s. And all these guys were still around in 1861 when the war breaks out. Randolph P. Marcy, longtime career officer, he was a lieutenant here at Fort Winnebago in the early 1830s. By this point, he is, I believe, a captain or a major prior to the war, but because of his long service, all these regular Army officers immediately jumped to either brigadier or major general grade. He attains first a brigadier and later a major generalship and serves as an aide to George B. McClellan early on in the war. In fact, his daughter marries George B. McClellan, so there's a little bit of a deeper connection there. McClellan is one of the earliest and more notable commanders of the war. He is a commander of the Army of Potomac during the Peninsula Campaign, one of the very first efforts to try to take Richmond directly. But he was also in command of the Union Army during the Battle of Antietam. So this is a guy who was aide-de-camp to the Union commander at the Battle of Antietam. After McClellan is dismissed because of his failure at the Battle of Antietam, Marcy remains in service and becomes Inspector General for the Union Army, and actually ends his career in the United States Army as Inspector General until his death in 1881. Edwin B. Sumner, another long-time career officer who was a captain at Fort Winnebago. At the beginning of the war, he immediately gets a major generalship and is in command of a division and an Army Corps. He is in command of a large number of troops during the Peninsula Campaign, is involved in some controversy because of his decisions and his criticism of his commanding officer during that campaign, but comes out of that campaign looking pretty good. But his big high moment comes at the Battle of Antietam as well. He is in command of, I believe, the 1st Army Corps. But the thing is that his part of the battlefield, he commits his soldiers to a disastrous attack that should never occur, resulting in an extreme amount of casualties, really putting the Union Army into a bad strait. And ultimately, as a result of his role in Antietam, he stays in the Army, but he's relieved of his corps command. The other general involved is one that fought from the other side, Daniel Ruggles, and one that is often not heard about. And Daniel Ruggles was also, I believe, a lieutenant in the mid-1830s. He resigns his commission, goes to serve in the Confederacy, gets appointed Brigadier General, and he is with Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston and his Army of Tennessee in the spring of 1862, when Johnston moves to attack the Union Army encampment of Ulysses S. Grant. Tonight. Grant is encamped along the Tennessee River. He thinks he's in a safe position when Johnston launches a surprise attack against Grant's army and almost destroys him, pushes his army back into the Tennessee River, and almost would have succeeded in destroying Grant and perhaps even his career at that point, had it not been for a few brigades that banded together, that were able to put up enough of a stubborn resistance. They were eventually surrounded, but formed a strong resistance for the Confederate attack. And it formed a core part of the battle and earned the nickname of Hornets' Nest because the bolts were flying so thick and so fast as it came to skirting out the batch of hornets. In a very, very stiff part of the battle. Daniel Ruggles was one of the brigade leaders that were trying to take out the Hornets' Nest, and in their desperation after attack after attack after attack, has failed to break that point in the Union line. Daniel Ruggles gets the idea of amassing a large portion of artillery onto that one single point. And at that point, I believe it's one of the largest assemblages of artillery anywhere in the battlefield of North America, and literally blasts the Hornets' Nest ultimately into submission. And the battery was known as Ruggles Battery. So after that, I mean, he still remains in the war, but that was his kind of pipeline. Now there are two other characters that are very notable. One very well known, and one almost not known at all. Of course, everybody knows the story of Jefferson Davis. He was a young lieutenant. Fort Winnebago was one of his earliest postings in the United States Army. He was a quartermaster for the fort, largely responsible for designing and building Fort Winnebago. After leaving the Army, Davis goes goes back to his home state of Mississippi, gets involved in politics, becomes a hero of the Mexican War, actually has a shining moment at the Battle of Buena Vista, becomes a senator from Mississippi, eventually becomes Secretary of War in the United States. And then in 1861, he resigns because he's again from Mississippi. I always kind of imagine someone like I guess in contemporary terms, imagine someone like, say, Robert Gates and John McCain, a great military hero, as well as major administrator leader. And he was the Secretary of War just before the war breaking out. So he resigns his position, so he's very prominent in the United States, I guess that's my point. In 1861, becomes the President of the United States. And ultimately, his fortune was high with the fortune of the United States. And is considered by many of his generation as one of the most notorious traitors for this country. That's the way he was looked upon in the 19th century. The other gentleman, though, actually probably committed even greater transgressions against the United States than Jefferson Davis ever did, at least in my opinion. That's David B. Twiggs. He is the first commander of Fort Winnebago. He's the guy who builds it. He's here for several years. He is a major at the time in 1828. So pretty high up ranking at that point. This is a very small United States Army. After he leaves Fort Winnebago, he continues his career in the U.S. Army. He has a very illustrious career. He's in the Mexican War, wins high accolades for his service in the Mexican War. And at the time in 1861, when the war breaks out, Twiggs is one of the very few brigadier generals in the United States Army. I think there's like only 2 or 3. The entire United States Army at that point. He's in command of 20% of the United States Army. He's in command of the Department of Texas and responsible for the border with Mexico. However, he is from Georgia. And very early in 1861, after Texas secedes from the Union, he immediately conspires to surrender his entire command to Confederate authorities. Whereas other officers and other congressional members like Davis or other Army officers simply resigned their commissions and then took up their posts with the Confederacy. David E. Twiggs used his position of authority as a significant Army officer to surrender 20% of the United States Army compared to the war. He ultimately is successful, and he goes to great lengths to achieve that end. It doesn't take long before I believe it's at that point, I'm sure it's Buchanan or Lincoln. It's in that transition time period, but I think it's Lincoln that learns of what Buchanan is trying, or what Twiggs is trying to do, tries to get him relieved from his command. Twiggs gets wind of that and orchestrates the Texas militia to march into San Antonio and compel the surrender of the Army garrison there. So, and then he resigns his commission. He's also cashiered from the Army almost simultaneously and takes up the major generalship in the Confederate Army. He's again quite elderly at this point, though, and he doesn't really get any major combat commands. He has a quiet year or so before he dies of an illness in 1863. So, in my opinion, actually, he's probably one of the more, certainly one of the more unknown, but also goes farther than you know. What's that? I believe ultimately they were exchanged fairly early. They were able to get out of Texas. A couple of the officers provided the papers, and they were able to make it to the coast of some of them were in the captive. And so they were in prison camps. But very early in the war, the persons for major prisoners. And it wasn't until, I don't think how long it was before, there were exchanges, prison exchanges, throughout much of the war. And it was only after the USS Grant took charge of the entire Union Army that he suspended all prisoner exchanges between the North and South Armies because he felt it was actually holding the Confederates more than the Union. The Confederates had a lesser population. And so the soldiers that were exchanged were supposed to be on parole and not serve in the army. All the soldiers were brought back. Whereas the Unions were brought back. So that's when you start seeing these kind of that's when you start seeing Anderson building prison camps swelling up because for the prison exchanges, as bad as those places were, it's kept the population down. So most of the soldiers probably didn't have reactions to things. Not that way, no. Well, the Union Army, chances are a lot of the officers in the Commonwealth, most of the enlisted men were either immigrants or working class, and a lot of the immigrants, a lot of the enlisted men were perhaps, say, from the industrial cities in the north. The officers, and most of the officers, not all of them, but a portion of the officers in the States in the South. And so that's why you have really brain very early in the war. That's the thing that Jefferson Davis. But most of the main leaders, all 8 people, all the main significant leaders, that became prominent with their families, were all the European officers. So there were a few Union officers that became prominent with their families. So it's interesting that a lot of them stayed in the soldiers. Grant was actually, some of the soldiers were actually in the Union Army that resigned and came back. Was, as I say, predominantly probably in those many of those that surrendered, but eventually it was a significant percentage of the officers that were sympathetic to these women. There were a few that were obviously not, and probably not this time, but immigrants from some of the places. Really, at this point, as I say, we're kind of at the end of the talk. I would just like to say and wrap up that Portage has I think that's a significant contribution to this project. They have an experience that runs the full gamut. If you include the guys who were in the heavy artillery unit, you have soldiers that were in the quietest sections of the war in the garrison duty. You have soldiers that are in the significant campaigns of the Western Theater. You have soldiers that are in the very first battles of the war of Bull Run. You have soldiers that are at Fall Richmond, the first soldiers who were captured in the city of Richmond. And you have soldiers who are at Fort Winnebago that have profound impacts on the course of the war overall. And as when you think of the significant history of Portage, it has what are very rich and important history as it is. It's very big for the community to have history like that. And with that, all the different regiments, it depends on where they're at. There's actually, off the top of my head, there are some very good books about there's book by Fox called I was in the 23rd and the 11th, which were in similar experiences. Throughout the course of the war, they probably suffered 20% of the combat casualty losses. The vast majority of the enlisted forces were all of them. This is the most significant loss of all the citizens. And so that's we've got Did something that suffers not just 50% faculty, was probably not, but I would say, over the course of time, over the course of the semester, and we have soldiers that are coming in as well. Now, of course, the second and seventh much higher casualties is also involved in a series of very severe battles over a quick period of time. Whereas you look at those other regiments, 19%, those guys, most of the guys are years, well, 2.5 years ago. So they have very involved in sea operations. Mostly that is in the country operations, disease. And really, the 19% seems involved in pretty major battles. So they're kind of 11th and 23rd are going to be closer, but again, they're involved in more combat activities. But again, it's over a longer period. There's a quick succession of battles where it's the Worcester, and there's the sea. Same thing with the sea. Disease for the would they have been from Portage, and then after 1863 also we had Wisconsin.
Where the lesson you said was 3 years, was that pretty standard?
Yes, 3 years for the duration of the war, so in the course of the 3 years the war ended, you go home.
Were there sevens for realistic?
There would have been. There were bounties. In fact, by 1863, there were incentives to enlist even before, before most of these regiments were up. By 1862, by early 1863, the nastiness of the war was very bad. And so we started seeing fewer enlistments. And so you started seeing bounties, you started seeing other forms of financial incentives come out, and then in 1863, the government resorts to the first act because of the men and the military signing up. It's significant to note that actually the Army of Potomac in 1864 changes as an army as a result of these first enlistments of 1861. Expired. The army that fights the Battle of Gettysburg, these are guys that sign up for 1861 out of strongly patriotic motivations to protect the country, the Constitution, protect the country. They've gone through 3 years of horrendous hell for lack of description. And most of these guys don't re-up when the enlistments are up. They are largely replaced by conscripts. So the army that chases Lee at the battles of the Wilderness, battles of Spotsylvania, goes into the siege of Richmond, especially Richmond, Petersburg, and those 2 months. The nature and character of the Army of Potomac changes, and that's actually noted. That's very evident when you look at the combat record and also when you read the accounts of some of the veterans and the officers. It's just not the same army. It's because the mentality just wasn't there. There's a road. There's a reason why Abraham Lincoln was actually very concerned that he was going to lose the election. Of course, now he gets handled, but the popular sentiment was they were getting worn out by the extreme casualties. So, soldiers, again, early on, enlisted for patriotic reasons. They also enlisted because their friends at home were enlisting. They were enlisted because it was going to be a great adventure, and that carries for about 3 years. You see a range anywhere late teens to early 20s is your average age. So I think you had to be. I'm trying to think of when this was. 17 to 18 years old. But you also have 19, 20, 22 years. That's not unheard of. It's unusual, but it's not unheard of. In what year? 1964? What unit did you school? So, which one? In 64? Well, late, you would have been, you could have been more than the number of days producers. At that point, you would have been in college system. Probably would have been too old for grad. I know it would have been too old for grad at that point, but you were in the financial sector. But eventually, you were still motivated by patriotic reasons to join up. I'm 40, so of course, you probably in kind of better shape than me. But but you know, if you had relatives or if you had friends that were already served and just felt that it was just time to go. A lot of guys did stay home early on in the war because, quite honestly, for me, it's a farm. Somebody would stay back and work the farm if they were able to find somebody to cover the spot either at work or there's any number of reasons why you know it. But it's not unusual for someone who is in their 30s or 40s to have enlisted. That was common. We get some if they're physically in shape, but also if they're in important physical shape, the conditions of pain life is easily taken into account. And so the fact that it's able to survive for a year, we may mention something else as better than that for this children. So it's interesting that he did sign on that. We were seeing more of that.
It's down in
I guess I just wanted to make a comment to the gentleman that was asking about the re-enlistment of the men. Those guys saw some pretty tough service. He mentioned at Gettysburg, when Reynolds led the guys into the woods, there was 682 men in the 2nd Wisconsin. When he took them back out that night, 130 answered roll call. That's pretty serious service. Those guys were tore up. It wasn't so much at the 2nd Wisconsin. There were a lot of them that came home, but Company A out of Fox Lake, I'm very strong into their history. They had 20-some men by late 64 when it was time to muster out. 11 of them re-upped. So we're still talking nearly 50% re-upped. But there just wasn't many of them. So the Iron Brigade kind of ceases to exist, and they attach the independent battalion and different groups like that. And a lot of them did fight again, but they didn't fight as the 2nd Wisconsin. They were just too tore up. They were ineffective. I think there was 68 guys and something like that in the 2nd Wisconsin by the time it was time to muster out. That's not very many considering there was 1,000 that left Madison. That's not very many at all.
Would you repeat the question so
Well,
we
you're
can
just
hear?
making a comment that in the forest there is a old Civil War museum in a barn off of Highway 51 by a privately owned museum. Just not too far from here, which I was not familiar with that. So there's another place I'll have to go visit.
You said by DeForest?
By DeForest. Or in DeForest. Off of Highway 51. These guys in the body.
I was just there a month ago. The Queen Historical Society chose to go there at one of their meetings, and we spent 2 hours in going through his museum. He explained it to Mr. Rod Gary, A-R-Y, Rodney. And yeah, he's been collecting Civil War for over 40 years. And he's getting older now, and he's got some illnesses. And he is looking for a place to move his stuff to, but his children aren't interested. And he's thinking about Milwaukee, someplace down by Milwaukee. But if you contact him and you have a group that wants to go through it, it's worth the trip. Very much so. Give him a donation. He's got a lot of stuff, a lot of information.
Is it marked up? Is there a sign off on it?
If we buy something on and get him opens it up.
Yeah, Rod Derry, you have to call him. I don't recall that it no one would know it was there if they drove by.
Yes, sir.
I'm hearing the infantry got played in this, but what about the cavalry?
As far as I know, the only cavalry unit that came out of Portage was the 4th Cavalry. I believe they started off as an infantry unit and then were transferred into cavalry service. And I have to admit, because I didn't see a lot of Portage soldiers in there, I didn't dig that deeply into the record. But they served throughout the duration. And I know they were in some battle circumstances. Though I don't really want to know about, but actually a good website to check out too, which is I think a very good kind of one-stop shop research on Wisconsin Civil War history is the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Those resources that I listed before, the roster of Wisconsin veterans, the regimental lists, and E.B. Kinner's military history, as well as another general history by a guy named Love, were all consolidated into a database. And so you can actually look up the Civil War ancestry. I believe you can get their Civil War record for a small price. But you can get regimental histories. If you type in 4th Wisconsin Cavalry, you can get a synopsis of the history online. There isn't a charge for that. And they use those resources to build that. The resources that I used actually were at the Sauk County Historical Society. Point to Mary, who's worked there for a number of years. But it's what makes Wisconsin actually a wonderful state to research Civil War history are those books. When I did for 5 years, I did living history interpretation for the National Park Service out in Petersburg, Virginia. This is why when I talk about Petersburg, I have a special warm feeling about it because I spent 5 years studying my campaign. But we were interpreting a Pennsylvania bridge. And when you try to track down Pennsylvania units in the war, and this is 15 years ago, they had a regimental roster of Pennsylvania units, but they didn't have that long alphabetical list. They didn't have a single book that covered all the regiments in Pennsylvania. There was over 200 of them, and their individual histories. All they had were the regimental rosters. Now, granted, this is back in the early 90s, individual regimental histories, but not a one-stop shop. Wisconsin, in the turn of the century, did it right. They published an alphabetical list of all the Wisconsin veterans. They published the regimental rosters, and they published, actually in 1866, a complete history of all the units that served in the war. So it's very easy to compile it. But I will confess, when it came to the 4th Cavalry, I did that.
Along a similar vein, do you know of any folks from town here that were part of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
There was actually a company from Wisconsin, I want to say, that became part of
Yes.
the Sharpshooters.
Yeah.
And it's, but I think that was one company from the entire state. But that same thing though, if you go to the regimental rosters, that will be listed in there, and they will show their hometown. I did not think to look at Verdun Sharpshooters.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious because Fox Lake had 11 of those
Really?
folks also. Yeah.
That's actually a fairly high number.
That's a very high number. Yeah. He became, I think he was a lieutenant of the organization as well after he left town. And he was a little brother of one of the captains, Captain Stevens, that actually died was shot next to Reynolds. He was, I think, a pretty strong recruiter. I think he took a bunch of buddies with him. That's what he did. But yeah, I know they had good numbers there. I just didn't know if there was numbers from this direction or not.
As far as I know, I didn't notice any. Actually, something like that, I would hope. I mean, one of the things that the Columbia County, 1880 Columbia County history was very good at. I mean, if there was a unit from Portage that went off in the war, whether there was a large unit or not, they mentioned it. And actually, that's online through the Wisconsin Historical Society, on the County Histories page. You can review that book, and so it's very easily accessible. But when I was reviewing that, I didn't see any mention, at least in the Portage section. And I was focusing almost exclusively on the city of Portage. I didn't see any mention of Verdun Sharpshooters.
Okay. Just
That's
curious.
a good point. Yes, ma'am.
At the time of Gettysburg, do you know if there were any other Wisconsin regiments in the Army at the moment?
The 3rd Wisconsin was there, I believe. But they were not in there would have been the 2nd, the 6th, and the 7th as a part of the Army Brigade. The 3rd Wisconsin, which actually was more in the rear guard section, another kind of non-combat section of the line. I want to say the 5th Wisconsin was involved out there as well. And I'm trying to remember where in the battle that they were at. the vast majority of Wisconsin soldiers were in the Western Theater. There were several other regiments that served in the Eastern Theater as well. I don't know if they were at Gettysburg. The 32nd Wisconsin was also out in the Eastern Theater of the war. I want to say that one of the major officers, I'm trying to think of who Frank Haskell was at the time, but he was wrote one of the more notable actual writings of the Battle of Gettysburg. Haskell, he actually published a book.
He was with the Iron Brigade.
He was with the Army. He was later with the 32nd, I believe, because he was killed with the
At Cold Harbor, he transferred. He got a command.
Yeah.
Regiment.
So he was with even with the 6th.
He was with what's the General. I can't think of it right now. General Buford, I think, wasn't he? Was it Buford or no?
But Buford was cavalry.
Yeah. No, it wasn't Buford then. I can't think of it. But he
Might have been with
was
the
at
6th.
Gettysburg, but he was with. He came there with the first. They were the first corps.
Yeah, that might have been 6th is ringing a bell. But so there were several other regiments, not a lot, but there are several other regiments that were listed there. One other question, and then we'll follow through.
Well, this isn't really a question, but I always thought it was interesting. And I don't know the whole story, but I think there's a couple people in this room who do, about the monument, the Wisconsin monument at Pittsburgh, and the connection with Portage.
That I do not know. That gentleman does?
Yeah, I know. It's not so granite building. I don't know what year, but in the 50s, Emerson Construction went down and refurbished it.
Okay.
And Bob Moore, who was their construction guy, he happened to be there, took some pictures, sent it to him, and gave him told me all about it. It was kind of interesting story. The Scots were granted to them initially, and then Emerson went back and took them.
Believe it or not, there is actually a publication on that. In the late the monument I know was built either in the late 19th or 20th centuries. The specific year it reads me, but there was essentially Wisconsin Civil War Commission. They published a number of regimental histories. There's actually a light artillery unit out of Lone Rock. They published Artilleryman's Diary. They published an account of 3rd Wisconsin. They published, I don't know if they published Haskell's account of Gettysburg first, but they published several first-hand accounts, but it was also that they published as they were building these monuments around these different battlefields. They published actually proceedings of the development of the monument, committee proceedings, and there's books that have been called the Wisconsin Monument at Vicksburg, and it's published or intended by that same commission, and that should actually outline the entire history of that monument. So it's been a very, very long question. I started to bring that up. It's been many years since I've looked at that book, but that's where he's absolutely right. I think that for further details, I can actually look that up. So the Wisconsin Historical Society should probably have a copy of that. I also tried a local historical society. One thing that when I first started working with Marion Salt County Historical Society is that the local historical societies have a lot of manuals that go back a long time, some very wonderful resources. So I would encourage historical societies, something like that. Might be surprised. Well, with that, I'll take one last question from the gentleman. I'll open up the end.
Just a comment to go along with that. It's kind of interesting to note. I don't know anything about the Vicksburg Monument, but a lot of those battlefield monuments actually were quarried here in Montello, 20 miles north, 15 miles north of here. So all of them at Gettysburg are. So kind of interesting point.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.